The Valori had ruled the stars for 12,000 years before humanity even learned to make fire ambassador. Kethrava stood in the command center of Valori Prime and watched her civilization die on 100 different screens. And her four-fingered hands would not stop shaking, no matter how hard she pressed them against the cold metal console the swarm had come 3 months ago, to a tier in space that no one had predicted and no one could explain. And in those 3 months, they had consumed everything in their path like a plague of hunger. Given physical form colony world Vethkai had fallen first. And Kethrava still remembered the final transmission from that world. The screaming that had filled the communication channels before everything went silent forever. Then came Moradi Station with its 2 million inhabitants. And then the agricultural world of Seneval that had fed a quarter of the collective. And now the swarm fleet hung in orbit above the homeworld itself. A wall of organic ships that blotted out the stars. The creatures themselves were nightmares made real. Standing 3 meters tall with bodies covered in black chitin and mouths filled with teeth designed for one purpose only. And they did not negotiate or communicate or show any sign of intelligence beyond the terrible cunning of a predator hunting prey. Kethrava had sent distress calls to every member of the Galactic Compact. All 47 spacefaring civilizations that had signed the Mutual Defense Treaty 8,000 years ago. And the responses had broken something inside her that she did not think could ever be repaired. The Etherian Dominion, whose fleets numbered in the tens of thousands, had sent a message expressing their profound spiritual solidarity with the Valori people and their hope that the universe would find balance in this difficult time. The Kreth Assembly, whose warriors were legendary across 100 systems, had promised to convene an emergency committee to assess potential response options within the standard 60-day deliberation period. The Marvathi Confederation had simply sent coordinates for refugee processing centers on the far side of the galaxy. A journey of 18 months for anyone who could escape the swarm blockade. Which was no one. They are not coming, said Kethrava's aide. A young male named Versh, whose scales had turned the pale gray of despair. None of them are coming to help us. I know, Kethrava replied. And her voice sounded strange and hollow in her own ears. She had served the collective for 200 years, had negotiated treaties and trade agreements and cultural exchanges with dozens of species. And she had always believed in the fundamental goodness of civilization, in the bonds that connected thinking beings across the vast emptiness of space. Now she understood the truth that her ancestors had somehow forgotten in their 12,000 years of peace. When the darkness came, everyone looked out for themselves. There is one more response, Versh said quietly. From the humans, Kethrava made a sound that was not quite a laugh. And the bitterness in it surprised even her. The humans were the youngest species in the compact, having achieved faster-than-light travel barely 40 years ago. And they were considered something of an embarrassment by the elder races. Their homeworld had a documented history of near-constant warfare stretching back to the dawn of their civilization. And they had nearly destroyed themselves at least twice before even reaching space. And their reputation in diplomatic circles was that of well-meaning but somewhat dangerous primitives who had somehow stumbled into the stars before they were ready. What do the humans say? Kethrava asked, not really caring. Do they also offer their thoughts and prayers? Versh handed her the communication tablet, and she read the message 3 times because she could not quite believe the words. It was short and blunt and written without any of the flowery diplomatic language that characterized interstellar communication. And it said simply, Terran Marine Corps acknowledges distress signal from Valori Collective. Hold your position. We are coming. Estimated arrival, 16 hours. Semper Fidelis. What does Semper Fidelis mean? Versh asked. I do not know, Kethrava admitted. And she pulled up the human database entry on her console. The information was sparse and confusing, and much of it seemed to contradict itself. The Terran Marine Corps was apparently a military organization within the human government, specializing in what the translation software called force projection and rapid response operations, and their motto Semper Fidelis translated roughly to always faithful. The entry noted that Marines were considered elite soldiers, even among the already violent human species, and that they had a cultural tradition of responding to any call for help, regardless of the personal cost, and that they had never in their 500-year history abandoned an ally under fire. 16 hours, Versh said, and hope flickered briefly in his eyes before dying. Can they really reach us in 16 hours from their homeworld? It does not matter, Kethrava replied, and the weight of reality pressed down on her like a physical force. The humans have 18 combat vessels, according to the Compact Registry, and the Swarm has over 200,000 ships in orbit. And even if the humans were the greatest warriors in the galaxy, it would make no difference against those numbers. She looked at the screens, showing the swarm drop pods falling toward the surface like black rain, each one carrying dozens of the creatures that would soon be tearing through the streets of her city. And she felt the last ember of hope go cold inside her. Send a response to the humans, she said finally. Thank them for their courage, and tell them not to come. Tell them there is nothing they can do here except die alongside us. Tell them to save their people, and remember the Valori when we are gone. Versh nodded and turned to send the message. But before he could finish, the communication console lit up with an incoming transmission. It was from the human vessel, and it was addressed directly to Kethrava. And it said, "Message received, respectfully declined. We do not abandon those who call for help. See you in 15 hours and 47 minutes. Colonel Marcus Chan, Commanding Officer, Terran Expeditionary Force." Kethrava read the message and felt something strange stir in her chest. Something that might have been hope, or might have been simply confusion at creatures who would fly across the galaxy to die for strangers. She did not understand humans, but she was beginning to think that perhaps no one did. Colonel Marcus Chun had been a Marine for 32 years and had fought in more conflicts than he could easily count. But he had never seen anything quite like the tactical display in front of him. Swarm Fleet filled the screen like a disease spreading across healthy tissue. 237,000 organic vessels, ranging from fighter-sized interceptors to massive hive ships the size of small moons. And all of them were positioned between his 18 assault carriers and the planet they had come to save. "Sir," said Lieutenant Commander Park, his tactical officer, and her voice was remarkably steady considering what they were looking at. "Enemy forces outnumber us approximately 13,000 to 1. I can do math, Commander," Chun replied. And he allowed himself a small smile that did not reach his eyes around him on the bridge of the Tm Canal. His crew worked with quiet efficiency, checking weapon systems and shield generators and the 1,000 other details that would determine whether they lived or died in the next few hours. These were his people, Chun thought, and he had led them through the pirate wars of the outer colonies and the rebellion on Mars, and the first contact disaster at Kepler 442b. And they had never once let him down, Colonel, Park said. "We are receiving a transmission from the Valori planetary government. They are asking us to turn back. Ignore it, sir. They say there is nothing we can do, that we should save ourselves and remember them." Chun turned away from the tactical display and looked at his crew, at the young faces and old faces and scared faces and determined faces that made up the crew of the finest assault carrier in the Terran fleet. "Put me on fleet-wide," he said. "You are live." "Sir." Chum took a breath and thought about what he wanted to say, about the words that would send these men and women into a battle that every mathematical calculation said they could not win. "Marines," he began. "You have all seen the tactical situation by now. And I am not going to lie to you about what we are facing. The odds are not in our favor. And some of us will not be going home after today. He paused and let that truth settle into the silence. But I want you to think about something. I want you to think about why we are here. Not because we were ordered to come, because we were not. High Command wanted to send a diplomatic protest through the Galactic Compact and wait for a coalition response. They thought that was the smart play. A few of his crew smiled at that. Knowing what was coming, I told them what I am about to tell you. That somewhere down on that planet there are people who called for help. People who watched the sky and prayed that someone would come and save them from the monsters eating their world. And every other civilization in this galaxy heard that call and decided it was not their problem. His voice hardened. We are Terran Marines. And we do not turn our backs on people who need us. That is not who we are, and it is not who we will ever be. Our ancestors fought and bled and died to build something worth believing in. And that something is the simple idea that the strong should protect the weak. That courage matters more than calculations. That some things are worth dying for. He looked directly into the communication camera. Today we are going to show the galaxy what humans are made of. We are going to fly into that swarm, and we are going to fight with everything we have. And when the history books talk about this battle, they are going to say that 18 ships stood against 200,000 because it was the right thing to do. He raised his fist. Semper Fi. Marines, the response came back from 17 ships. From 30,000 voices united in a single roar that made the speakers crackle. Semper Fi. Chun nodded to his communications officer. Cut the transmission. Commander Park, what is the status of our drop forces? All divisions report ready for orbital insertion. Colonel, 15,000 Marines in powered armor waiting in drop pods. Good. Here is the plan. 1st and 2nd Divisions will conduct combat drops to the capital city and establish a defensive perimeter around the civilian population centers. 3rd Division will hold in reserve for rapid response. The fleet will engage the swarm in orbit and keep them busy while our ground forces dig in. Sir, Park said carefully, the enemy fleet will tear us apart. We cannot survive a sustained engagement against those numbers. I know, Chun replied. We do not need to win the space battle. We just need to buy time for the ground forces to establish themselves. Once our Marines are dug in, they can hold until reinforcements arrive. What reinforcements? Colonel, Chen smiled, and this time it was genuine. When the Compact sees what we do here today, they will send reinforcements, I guarantee it. Civilizations that hide from monsters do not stay hidden when someone else shows them how to fight back. He turned to face the main screen, where the swarm fleet was already moving to intercept. All ships advanced to attack formation, weapons free on all enemy vessels. And someone get me a channel to the Valori government. The channel opened and Kethrava's face appeared on screen. Her alien features twisted with confusion and something that might have been fear, Colonel Chun. She said, You cannot do this. You will all die. Maybe, Chun acknowledged. But your people will live. That is what matters. Why? She asked. And the words seemed torn from somewhere deep inside her. We are nothing to you. Why would you sacrifice yourselves for strangers? Chun thought about the question for a moment. Thought about all the complex answers he could give about duty and honor, and the long bloody history of humanity that had somehow forged a species capable of such terrible violence into one that channeled that violence in defense of others. But in the end, the answer was simple, because you asked, he said. And we heard you. He cut the transmission. All hands, battle stations. Drop pods launch in 10 minutes. The TMS Guadalcanal surged forward, and behind her came 17 sisters. And together they flew into the jaws of death with something that looked almost like joy. The sky above Valori Prime burned with falling stars that were not stars at all, from her position in the underground command bunker, Ambassador Kethrava watched the orbital feeds with a mixture of horror and disbelief as thousands of metal objects plunged through the atmosphere, each one trailing fire and smoke as it screamed toward the surface below. "What are those?" Vosh asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Drop pods," said a voice from behind them, and both Valori spun around and an alarme figure stood in the doorway of the bunker. And for a terrible moment, Kethrava thought the swarm had already breached their defenses, because the thing before her did not look like anything she recognized as alive. It was humanoid in shape, but covered entirely in matte black armor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And where its face should have been, there was only a smooth helmet with a single glowing visor that tracked her movements with predatory precision. Then the helmet retracted with a soft hiss, and beneath it was something that Kethrava had seen only in diplomatic files. A human face. It was a young female with dark brown skin and eyes that seemed too old for her apparent age. And she was smiling in a way that showed teeth. "Lieutenant Okonkwo," the human said. "Force reconnaissance. Terran Marine Corps. We inserted ahead of the main assault to coordinate with local forces and establish tactical intelligence. How did you get in here?" Kethrava demanded. "This bunker is protected by 3 levels of security shields. With respect, Ambassador, your security systems are about 8,000 years out of date." Lieutenant Okonkwo replied, "I could give you a full technical breakdown, but we do not really have time for that right now." She moved to the main console with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for someone wearing what had to be at least 100 kilograms of armor. And her fingers danced across the controls like she had been using Valori technology her entire life. "What are you doing?" Vosh asked. "Linking your sensor grid to our tactical network. The kernel needs real-time data on swarm movements, and your detection systems are actually pretty good even if your security is not." On the screens, the drop pods were hitting the ground now, slamming into the earth with impacts that threw up clouds of dirt and debris. And Kethrava watched in amazement as armored figures emerged from the wreckage, already moving. Already fighting. The swarm had reached the outskirts of the capital city. Thousands of the creatures pouring through the streets in a tide of black chitin and snapping jaws. And they had been encountering almost no resistance from the overwhelmed Valori Planetary Guard. That changed the moment the Marines touched down. Weapons fire erupted across the city. Brilliant beams of energy and streams of what looked like solid metal tearing through the swarm ranks with devastating efficiency. And the humans did not take cover or advance cautiously, or do any of the things the military doctrine said soldiers were supposed to do. They Adaket Johra watched a single Marine charge directly into a group of 20 swarm creatures. The armored figure moving so fast it was almost a blur, and within seconds all 20 of the monsters were dead, and the Marine was already moving toward the next group. "Your soldiers," she said slowly, trying to understand what she was seeing. "They do not seem to be afraid." Lieutenant Okonkwo looked up from the console, and her smile widened. "Afraid of what?" "Ambassador, these things are not even the worst thing we have fought this year. But there are so many of them, millions of them. And your people number only thousands." The human made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Ambassador, do you know what humanity spent most of its evolutionary history doing?" "I do not understand the question." "Fighting," Okonkwo said. "Fighting predators that wanted to eat us. Fighting each other for territory and resources. Fighting diseases and famines and natural disasters that should have wiped us out 100 times over. We spent 200,000 years learning how to survive against things that were bigger and stronger and more numerous than us." She gestured at the screens, showing the battle raging through the city. "These swarm creatures are scary. I will give you that. But they are not smarter than us. They do not adapt faster than us. And they have never fought anything that fights back the way we do. How do you fight back?" Kethrava asked. "With everything we have," Okonkwo replied. with weapons and tactics and sheer stubborn refusal to die, but mostly with something you probably do not have a word for in your language. What is that? The human's eyes met hers, and Kethrova saw something ancient and terrible lurking behind them. Something that had been forged in the fires of a world that never stopped trying to kill the creatures that lived on it. Spite, Okonkwo said. The absolute burning determination to make sure that anything that tries to kill us regrets it, even if that regret is the last thing it ever feels. An explosion rocked the bunker, and dust fell from the ceiling as the lights flickered. Swarm forces are approaching this location, Okonkwo said, checking a display on her wrist. Approximately 300 hostiles. They must have detected the sensor uplink. Kethrova felt fear grip her hearts. We need to evacuate. We cannot fight that many. You cannot fight that many, Okonkwo corrected her, and she was already moving toward the door. I can. Stay here and keep the sensor link active. My squad will handle the rest. Your squad, how many soldiers do you have? Okonkwo paused at the doorway and looked back over her shoulder. 4, including me. Then she was gone, the door sealing behind her, and moments later, Kethrova heard the sounds of combat. Weapons fire and explosions and the terrible screaming of swarm creatures dying in large numbers. It lasted less than 5 minutes when it was over. Lieutenant Okonkwo walked back into the bunker with her armor scorched and dented, and a long scratch across her helmet that had come within centimeters of her face. Threat neutralized, she said calmly. You should probably stay away from the north corridor for a while, though. It is pretty messy up there. Kethrova stared at this creature that looked so much like the primitive species in the diplomatic files, but was clearly something else entirely. Something that the universe had never prepared the Valori to understand. What are you? She asked. Lieutenant Okonkwo smiled again, and this time there was no humor in it at all. We are the people who answer when you call for help, Ambassador, and we are very good at our job. The battle for Valori Prime lasted 72 hours, and every single one of those hours was paid for in blood. Colonel Chun stood on the broken steps of what had once been the Valori Grand Archive, a building that had housed 12,000 years of art and literature and history before the swarm burned it to the ground. And he watched his Marines fight and die to hold a line that should have collapsed a dozen times already. The stimulants were the only thing keeping him upright now. Chemical cocktails pumping through his bloodstream that told his body the signals from his exhausted muscles, and screaming nerves were lies, and that he could keep going for just a few more hours. All of his Marines were running on the same drugs. Had been since the first day when it became clear that there would be no rest and no relief and no hope except what they created themselves. The swarm had learned quickly that the humans were not like other prey, and they had adapted their tactics accordingly. No longer throwing mindless waves of creatures at the defensive lines, but probing for weaknesses and concentrating their forces against vulnerable points. But the humans adapted faster, Sergeant. Major Williams had figured out that the swarm command creatures could be identified by subtle differences in their chitin patterns and had implemented a targeting protocol that prioritized them above all other targets. Cutting off the swarm's coordination at critical moments, Captain Rodriguez had developed a rotating defense strategy that kept fresh units on the front lines, while exhausted ones recovered in protected zones, maximizing the effectiveness of their limited numbers. And Private First Class Sarah Chun, no relation to the colonel, had discovered entirely by accident that the swarm creatures were vulnerable to certain sonic frequencies and had rigged every Marine's communication system to broadcast a disruptive signal that made the monsters slower and less coordinated. They were winning impossibly, against all odds and reason, but they were also dying. The casualty reports scrolled across Chun's tactical display in a constant stream of names and numbers that he forced himself to read because these were his people, and they deserved to be remembered. Corporal James Morrison, killed holding a bridge crossing for 6 hours while reinforcements evacuated a civilian shelter. Lieutenant Sarah Okonkwo, killed leading a counterattack that pushed the swarm back 3 blocks and saved 2,000 Valorant lives. Gunnery Sergeant William Park, killed when he drove a damaged transport loaded with explosives into a swarm hive ship that was deploying fresh troops. 187 Marines dead in the first day, 312 in the second, and the numbers kept climbing as the battle ground on, and the swarm kept coming, and the humans kept refusing to break. On the third day, the swarm threw everything they had at the human defensive line. A coordinated assault involving over 1 million creatures attacking from every direction at once. And for 6 terrible hours, Chun was certain they were going to lose. Private Rodriguez held a barricade alone for 4 hours with a broken arm and a rifle that had overheated twice, killing over 200 swarm creatures before they finally pulled him back for medical treatment that he refused until his sergeant ordered him at gunpoint to stop. Fighting Corporal Yamamoto found herself surrounded when her squad was overrun and called an airstrike on her own position rather than let the swarm use her as bait. And the explosion took nearly 400 of the creatures with her. Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell kept directing fire for his platoon for 3 hours after a collapsing building crushed both his legs. And when they finally got him to a medic, he was still giving orders and did not stop until blood loss made him physically incapable of speech. These were the stories that would be told. Chun knew the individual acts of courage and sacrifice that would become legends, but they were only a fraction of what his Marines accomplished in those 72 hours. Every single one of them fought like something out of a nightmare. And the swarm learned to fear the armored figures that would not stop coming, no matter how many of them died. By the end of the third day, the assault had broken. The swarm forces scattered and retreating, their fleet in orbit burning from the relentless attacks of the surviving Terran ships. And for the first time since the battle began, Chun allowed himself to believe they might actually win. He found Ambassador Kathrova standing in the ruins of the command creature he had personally killed with a plasma lance and 17 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition. And she was looking at the battlefield with an expression he could not read. "Why?" she asked. And her voice was raw with something that might have been grief or wonder or both. "You have lost over 1,000 of your soldiers. You came here knowing you would probably die. Why would you do this for people you do not even know?" Chun was quiet for a long moment, thinking about all the Marines who would not be going home, all the families who would receive folded flags and condolence letters, and the knowledge that their loved ones had died on a world they had never heard of for a species they had never met. "There is a saying where I come from," he said finally. "No better friend, no worse enemy. It is the unofficial motto of the Marine Corps. It means that if you are our ally, we will die for you, and if you are our enemy, we will make you wish you had never been born." He turned to face her. "You called for help. Ambassador, that means you are a friend, and we do not abandon friends, not ever. Not for any reason, even when it costs you everything, especially then," Chun replied. "Because that is when it matters most." Kathrova was silent for a long time, looking at this strange creature from a violent little world that had somehow produced beings capable of such terrible beauty. "I do not understand your species," she admitted. "Neither do we," Chun said. And for the first time in 3 days he smiled. "But we are working on it." In the distance, the last of the swarm forces were being hunted through the wilderness by Marines who had somehow transitioned from desperate defense to aggressive pursuit without stopping to rest. And above them, the stars were clear of enemies for the first time in months. The battle for Valori Prime was over. The humans had won. The news of what happened at Valori Prime spread across the galactic compact like fire through dry grass within. Hours of the battle's end, every major civilization in the galaxy had received detailed reports of the engagement, complete with sensor data and casualty figures and footage of human marines fighting through the streets of an alien city against impossible odds. The reactions varied widely. The Etherian Dominion, who had offered only spiritual solidarity when the Valori called for help, released a statement expressing their profound admiration for the courage displayed by Terran forces and their hope that all civilizations might learn from this example of selfless service. The Kreth Assembly, whose emergency committee had still not finished its assessment of response options, quietly disbanded the committee and began restructuring their entire military doctrine around human tactical principles. The Morvathi Confederation, who had been halfway to the other side of the galaxy when the humans arrived at Valori Prime, turned their refugee fleet around and began the long journey home, suddenly aware that running from the swarm might not be the only option. But the most significant reaction came from species that were still under swarm assault, worlds that had sent their own distress calls and received the same empty promises that the Valori had gotten. 3 weeks after the Battle of Valori Prime, the Terran Marine Corps received 17 new requests for military assistance from species across 4 different galactic sectors. Colonel Chun, who had been promoted to general and given command of the newly formed Terran Expeditionary Force, looked at the requests and felt something he had not expected to feel: pride, not pride in himself or even in his Marines, but pride in what humanity had become. In the long bloody journey from violent primitives fighting over scraps of territory to a species that would cross a galaxy to help strangers in need. "General," said his aide, a young lieutenant named Park, who was the son of the tactical officer who had died in the orbital battle above Valori Prime, "the Galactic Compact has requested a formal meeting to discuss the establishment of a mutual defense partnership with the Terran government." "What kind of partnership?" "They want us to lead the coalition against the swarm, sir. They are offering full access to their military resources, their shipyards, their technology, everything." Chun thought about that for a moment. 6 months ago, humanity had been considered a minor species. Violent primitives who had stumbled into the stars before they were ready. And the elder races had looked at them with a mixture of condescension and concern. Now those same elder races were asking humans to lead them into war. "Schedule the meeting," Chun said, "and tell the compact representatives that we will be happy to discuss partnership. But they should understand something first." "What is that?" "Sir, we do not fight wars to gain power or territory or influence. We fight to protect people who cannot protect themselves. If they want our help, that is the deal. We lead the coalition and we set the rules of engagement. And the first rule is that we do not leave anyone behind." Lieutenant Park nodded and left to deliver the message. And Chun turned back to the tactical display showing the current disposition of swarm forces across the galaxy. There were a lot of them. Billions of creatures spread across hundreds of systems. And the war to stop them would take years or maybe decades and would cost more lives than he wanted to think about. But for the first time since the swarm had emerged from whatever dark corner of the universe had spawned them, the galaxy had hope. And that hope had come from a small blue world that most civilizations had barely noticed. A world whose inhabitants had spent their entire history fighting each other until they had finally found something more worthy of their violence. Ambassador Kethrava visited Chun before he departed for the front lines, and she brought with her a gift that had been crafted by the finest artisans on Valori Prime. It was a small statue depicting a human Marine in powered armor, and beneath the figure was an inscription in both Valori script and Terran English. "Kethmer," Kethrava explained. "It is an old word in our language, very old. We had almost forgotten what it meant until you showed us." "What does it mean?" The spirit that does not break, she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. The courage that endures when all hope is gone. We thought it was just a myth. A story we told ourselves about ancestors who were braver than us. But then you came and we understood that it was real. She took his hand in her four-fingered grip. You saved my people. General Chun, not just our lives, but our belief in something greater than survival. And we will never forget that. Chun looked at the statue and thought about all the Marines who would never see their homes again. All the families broken and lives lost in defense of a world that had been nothing but a name on a star chart 6 months ago. We did not do it for gratitude, he said quietly. I know, Kathrava replied. That is what makes it matter in the years that followed. The Terran expeditionary force grew from 18 ships to 1,800, and the war against the swarm spread across a quarter of the galaxy. And humanity found its place among the stars, not as conquerors or traitors, but as protectors. Species that had never spoken to each other learned to fight side by side under human command. And tactics that had been developed in the mud and blood of Earth's endless wars proved devastatingly effective against an enemy that had never faced prey that refused to run. And always, at the front of every battle, were the Marines. They became legends. Stories told by 100 different species in 100 different languages. Tales of armored figures who would charge into certain death without hesitation and somehow emerge victorious against all odds. But the most enduring story was the simplest one. When the darkness comes, call for the humans. They will answer, and they will never stop fighting until the darkness is gone. That was the legacy of the Battle of Valori Prime. The moment when a young and violent species found its purpose among the stars. And the galaxy learned that sometimes the greatest warriors are not those who fight for power or glory, but those who fight because someone needed help and they could not walk away. The end.